Hello everyone, welcome to the 8th webinar in the Joint Tran-SET webinar series. Tran-SET is Region 6 University Transportation Center. It's a collaborative partnership between 9 major institutions and 2 community colleges with coverage across 5 states, Arkansas, Louisiana, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas. Tran-SET is led and administered by Louisiana State University. As a part of Tran-SET's response to COVID-19, this afternoon, we are very privileged to have 3 very distinguished speakers who are going to cover the impacts of COVID-19 on transportation and logistics from 3 quite different perspectives. We will have 3 15 to 20-minute presentations, and we will save the questions until the end of these 3 presentations for a quick 15-minute group Q&A. And the questions will be anonymous and will come from the Q&A box, so please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box throughout the session. Without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker, Laura Pirota. Laura is the president and CEO of the American Highway Users Alliance, a nonprofit 501c6 advocacy organization serving as the united voice of the transportation community, promoting safe and congested highways and enhanced freedom of mobility. Laura has worked in the association world for the past 16 years. Laura, I will turn it over to you now.
Excellent. Thank you so very much. I really appreciate this opportunity. Give me 1 second to get my slides up. Can everyone see my slides now? I hope. Oman, can you see the slides? I just want to make sure.
I can see your slide.
Okay, perfect. Just wanted to make sure. Thank you so much. My apologies. I just didn't want to start diving right in and leave everyone wondering what I was talking about. So let me introduce myself. Thank you for the introduction. Again, just to reiterate, I've been in transportation policy since 2008. I'm actually relatively new to the highway users. We are a 501c6 based in Washington, D.C. We're a coalition of 300 members who are made up of trade associations, companies, associations who all care about making sure that we have good roadway infrastructure investment into the future. And also just safer roads, less congested roads, really an advocacy-oriented organization. We try to move Congress to enact good policy. We do a lot of work on streamlining of roadway projects to try and make them go faster. And also we try and offer the latest news from Capitol Hill related to transportation policy based on the highways. So that's just a little background on who we are. I'm going to talk to you about a legislative perspective on kind of a look back at what Congress has done this Congress to try and get a long-term highway bill, and how COVID-19 is going to be impacting those efforts and revenues into the future from the federal perspective. So first, let me talk a little bit about a look back at what Congress has done to date. So back the summer of 2019, the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee passed S-2302, commonly called a TIA, and it was a 5-year bill with robust increase in funding for roadways. I believe it was around a 27% increase in highway funding, $287 billion over 5 years. It was a very bipartisan effort, and to date, many in the Senate would like to see this to be the vehicle for the next transportation authorization approval. Then in the House, in January, late January, the Democrats released their framework for what they'd like to see in the transportation authorization, a $319 billion bill over 5 years. But I must stress, this was literally just a framework. There wasn't any bill text, just parameters on what they were looking to invest in. This was a much larger infrastructure package than just the traditional transportation authorization. So it was very robust. One thing of note is, the constant tussle between how much money goes to highways and how much goes to transit. that 80-20 split that historically has been the premise of our policies generally is shifting slightly. Highways would get 75.8% of the revenue under this concept, and transit would get 24.2%, just to put that on your radar screen. And then we had Trump's budget that came out in February, I believe, off my memory, $810 billion surface transportation reauthorization proposal over 10 years. If you compared this to 5 years of the Senate bill, it's about $13.9 billion less. I just wanted to give you this background just to give you an idea of what Congress had done on trying to get a new transportation reauthorization at the federal level leading up to what happened with COVID. So timing too, the current transportation authorization proposal will expire on September 30th. So right around the corner, and the Senate Commerce Committee and Senate Finance still have to work on their titles before that S-2302 could come to the Senate floor. I know they are working on them, but of course with COVID, everything's been kind of thrown into upheaval as far as face-to-face interactions, of course. Most of the Congress, as far as congressional staff, are teleworking from home. Really, it's just some leadership folks and some key people that are up in the Capitol offices. So it's a real remote situation right now. And also Washington, D.C. is under stay-at-home orders too. So it makes a difficult working environment. Chairman Barrasso continues to push leadership to try and move his bill S-2302 to the floor and get a vote. And then at the same time, the House is working on their bill. So like I mentioned, the House had a framework that they released in January, but they're working on their legislative text for their transportation reauthorization. The timing's fluid, obviously, with everything that's been going on. Originally, they had hoped to really launch this in April, and now we're looking at, they're talking about potentially releasing the bill in May, June timeframe. It's just very fluid right now. And again, it's just all because of logistics of everyone working remotely and the problems with trying to get everyone together on getting this language into print. So obviously COVID has absolutely put the whole government and the whole country into upheaval, as we all know. This is just a recap of the different phases of legislation we have seen to date on COVID relief. I'll stress that Congress has really had to focus on COVID relief to date, to not COVID recovery. That's kind of down the road because this is such an ongoing unfolding of trauma for the entire nation, and it just keeps getting worse. So you saw phase one back at the beginning of March, $8 billion just to help prevent the spread. Phase two, $192 billion on March 18th, it was signed. Expand access to free testing, provide food aid, and extend sick leave benefits. In phase three, $2 trillion, March 27th. Checks to Americans, hospital grants, small business loans, money for transit, aviation, and Amtrak. There was nothing in there for roadways, although there was $150 billion to state and local governments with some flexibilities. But to date, I don't believe that's been going to the DOTs from anything I've heard. I could be wrong. Phase 3.5, $484 billion on April 23rd for small business loans, money for hospitals, and more money for testing. Now, since I did these slides yesterday afternoon, Speaker Pelosi in the House released COVID-4, which is a very broad bill. It's 1,800 pages long. And in this legislation, there is $15 billion for state DOT relief, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about AASHTO's request in a few minutes. So at least it's a starting point, not anywhere near close for what they were asking for. And then also there was $15.7 billion in additional transit relief. In this phase three package, there was I believe $25 billion at that time for transit relief. Now we're looking at an additional $15.7 billion for transit relief in phase four. And on top of that, this $15 billion for DOT relief. And this bill is just massive that she just released. They're calling it the HEROES Act. And her goal is to get it passed through the House this Friday. It is extremely Democratic bill. It wasn't bipartisan. The Republicans had no part in the crafting of this legislation at all. That being said, that the Senate Republicans are not going to just pick this up and rubber stamp it. This is going to be a long process, I'm afraid, to get this next recovery bill passed from my perspective. So the infrastructure debate and COVID relief, the AASHTO, the State Departments of Transportation, had been requesting $50 billion in state DOT relief. That would be over 18 months. Is what they're projecting their need is. We're going to go in a little more detail in a minute on that. Also, the debate on that Trump continues to talk about is trying to get a $2 trillion infrastructure investment in a future relief and recovery package. Now, obviously, this would be a much bigger, long-term type bill, something like Senator Barrasso, the chairman of the Environment and Public Works Committee, is pushing for. And also, Speaker Pelosi has been very supportive of infrastructure investment as well. But I would stress, everyone's kind of in agreement that this will have to be part of a recovery relief package rather than the initial relief packages. So I don't know that this means it's a phase 5, phase 6. I think it's all unknown, especially with this being an election year. There's a lot of uncertainty. The timing is just absolutely uncertain. And also I must stress the quarantine length and damage is unknown. While some states are beginning to reopen, others like Washington, D.C. are not at this point in time. Our current stay-at-home order, I believe, expires May 15th. So I'm guessing we're going to see an extension, although I haven't seen anything recently on that. So it's a very tricky situation when Washington, D.C. is under stay-at-home orders, as is Virginia and Maryland, and Congress is expected to produce all this, 1,800 pages in legislation. This is a very fluid process right now. But if there's a particular item that you really want to have heard in this COVID relief efforts this summer, I would stress, Congress, even though they're not physically in their offices every day, they're still very responsive. If you have a particular interest or concern you want to raise, feel free to always email their staff, because they're very responsive and they're tied to their computers, even if they're tied to them at home. So you can always send emails and have a say in what's going on. Now, the state DOT emergency relief request, the $50 billion for fiscal year 2020 and 2021, is based on the projection from the state DOTs that they're going to see at least around a 30% cut in state transportation revenue over the next 18 months. So that's where the $50 billion number came up. Now, I'm just guessing Congress was trying to do, or at least the Democrats in the House were trying to do, with the $15 billion in DOT relief that they just issued in this HEROES Act, which again has not been passed and probably won't be passed until after Memorial Day at least. I believe comes from the AASHTO proposal was $15 billion for the first year, and then the remainder making up the $50 billion over fiscal year 21. So I think that this combines to give you that $50 billion, and this was just a first offering from the House Democrats. It's going to be a fight to get increased funding for the DOTs, because basically everyone's in dire situation and everyone needs a bailout at this point in time. But these funds would be used as a backstop, essentially treated as state funds, giving states flexibility in how they obligate these dollars, whether it's salaries, operational, maintenance, really just trying to give them this flexibility when their revenues are going to have such a hit between decreased motor vehicle driving and user fees from diesel and gasoline sales, from reduces in sales taxes, reduced auto sales. All these things that pay into the various state highway trust funds are just going to have a massive hit. And unfortunately, the cliff there's a little bit of a lag time with a lot of this transportation funding, where we haven't even seen the big cliff yet. That's really going to be coming in a month or two, where we're going to see how bad this is getting. So the Federal Highway Trust Fund situation's pretty dire. U.S. gasoline production has stabilized at 250 million gallons per day, but we've saw such crazy fluctuations. And now, we're down 40% from pre-COVID, 400 million gallons per day level. And the Highway Trust Fund account is impacted basically $25 million per day. So this is, the cliff is coming. There were, the Congressional Budget Office just released earlier this week the revenue decline for the Highway Trust Fund just a few days ago, and it was 14%. So not up at that 30 to 50% that's projected. And the reason being is just that lag time, because it takes a while for what's happening at the pump to catch up in the CBO's projections. So there's just a little lag time here, and we're gonna, again, the numbers that we're gonna see in June and July are gonna be where we're gonna see the severe drop. So COVID recovery, from the highway users' perspective, we think it should focus on infrastructure when they get to the recovery part. There's obviously massive needs for infrastructure improvements, $786.4 billion backlog of highway and bridge investments, according to the US Department of Transportation Conditions and Performance Report, the 23rd edition that just came out most recently. And we're requesting, long-term, robustly funded highway reauthorization in the recovery package. That is our top priority. And then also, we need more reliable funding for the Highway Trust Fund. And again, the state revenue absolutely needs to be shored up. I mean, the Highway Trust Fund is, as we all know, in dire situation. We need a long-term fix, whether it's a fuel tax increase, which the highway users has been supportive of, whether down the road it's moving to a vehicle miles traveled tax, which is something I think Congress realizes eventually they have to get to, although there was a lot of backlash to some of the things they were floating this spring as far as a commercial vehicle miles traveled tax, and fees on electric vehicles, and even indexing the fuel taxes was a non-starter for a lot of the Republicans. They saw that as a fuel tax increase. So we have a long slog ahead of us to make the Highway Trust Fund more solvent. But since those fuel taxes at the federal level haven't been increased since 1993, it's beyond about time. And from our perspective, the highway users want a dedicated Highway Trust Fund that's user fee-based. And we absolutely need to do something to make our roadways a priority into the future for America, for our economy, and for safety too. I mean, there's a massive needs for safety on our rural, particularly, and urban roads. So last, I would just say, I would argue that this is another reason this should be part of the recovery effort, is infrastructure jobs are created when you invest in infrastructure. They're good paying jobs. Many of them, most of them can be performed outside in the open air. They've been classified as essential by the Department of Homeland Security. And, they could employ some displaced workers, which we've seen how massive the unemployment situation is in this country at this point in time. And I can't see it getting better in the near future. So that is my summary, and I will turn it over to the next speaker. And I'm happy to take questions at the end. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks, Laura. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, Brandon.
Okay, great. So thanks for that presentation, Laura. It's really interesting stuff, and I can see how kind of the funding aspect of it also links into the planning aspect of freight, and justifying why those dollars should go to freight planning and to your local municipality or your local state, for instance. So this presentation, I'm going to be mostly talking about ways that what we're seeing with freight demand during the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as some of the new data tools and planning opportunities that this presents, to bring freight more into the holistic mindset of mobility. We often think of mobility as multimodal when it comes to, I think, private mobility, when it comes to transit or driving your car or taking active transportation, but there's a lot of benefits to including freight planning within that broader multimodal mindset to enhance it and also make the overall mobility network more nimble and flexible. So what are we seeing currently? So currently, access to goods is saving lives. I think every day we see a new news article about, this medical supply shipment coming from this country or this state getting held up or arriving early. So what we're seeing is a real life, almost kind of snapshot of the goods movement and supply chain system changing in a really quick time frame. And I guess this is kind of unprecedented, at least in my timeline. And it's really interesting to see how, it kind of emphasizes how the freight network, it's not a static network that's always going to be the same over time. It does fluctuate and change based off of economic factors that change. And I think what's bringing to light is that we have this supply chain and freight network that is a vital component of contributing and supporting the quality of life that we enjoy. But oftentimes when it comes to doing master plans and things of that nature, maybe it's not given as much priority as other modes. So what we're seeing across the states is, between March 16th and May 8th, we've seen goods movement activity drop. But even with the drop, we're seeing about 79 to 80% of normal activity across Canada and the US. There are certainly certain areas of the two nations that are impacted a little more than other areas. And a lot of this has to do with, as Laura had mentioned, some stay-at-home advisories or emergency measures in certain states, and in other states are less affected, so they can continue to support that supply chain. But for the most part, we see that, even in some of the hardest hit areas like New York and New Jersey, that goods movement is still around 65% of typical levels, emphasizing the importance that that network provides. When we look at the type of vehicles that are currently operating and still operating, we see that what we're seeing is a little shift between maybe the courier deliveries, so the smaller vehicles that typically do deliveries between offices or smaller uses, and then we see the larger vehicle deliveries like heavy duty or light duty trucks maintaining closer to that 75-85% of typical volumes. When we look at the type of trips that these goods are serving now during COVID-19, it kind of shows that stark contrast on those staples like grocery store deliveries and warehousing tied with online deliveries have seen a spike, and that's to reflect the changing demand from a bunch of people across the continent that no longer can go to a store and purchase an item. Now they have to get it delivered either through Amazon or through an online retailer, and that has implications for warehousing and how those goods are delivered. But what the COVID-19 pandemic is, it's a really large example of a disruption on the goods movement network. But what we have to keep in mind is that, on a regular basis, even when things are going well, small disruptions on the freight network can lead to larger ones. So I'm going to show some examples. So right here, the Interstate 80 that crosses the US between San Francisco and New Jersey, there's a few portions of that corridor that tend to have disruptions, particularly in California and the mountains, where snow can often prevent vehicles from taking this critical route, and it has a resulting impact on the cost of freight as well as the time for that freight to move. And so this is one example of how maybe it's not as widespread as a pandemic, but certainly these daily disruptors can lead to large impacts on the network. Another example, I'm based in Toronto, so this one I actually worked on. There's one highway that connects the entire country. I guess South Park made a joke about the one highway across Canada, but in reality, in some places that's true. And this highway that connects Ontario, which is kind of the economic hub of Canada with Manitoba, that actually had an issue with the bridge where vehicles weren't allowed to pass over. And the only alternative route was to go through the US, which was thankful we had that alternative route. But the implications of that deviation had some real tangible economic impacts, especially when we look at the volume of vehicles that use that corridor. That's about $100 million worth of goods that pass through that bridge every day that had to be deviated. So this is an example of how, maybe when we plan freight, we need to look at, are there enough redundancies or is there enough flexibility in the system so that if these unforeseen circumstances do occur, that the network can adjust and cater to those demands as they arise. And I guess this links into kind of the status quo approach that typically is used in at least a lot of jurisdictions I've worked in, where I tend to get a sense that freight or goods movement is often looked at in a way of where can we limit where it should go so it doesn't impact the community, instead of maybe taking a different approach and saying, hey, how can we really enhance the freight movement so that these trucks don't feel the need to go through these neighborhoods and things like that. It's a bit of a different perspective. And the reality and the reason that's important is because, over the past 5 years, online deliveries have expanded significantly. And so what was typically expected in terms of freight deliveries maybe 10 years ago, that's completely changed to a certain degree in terms of now we're seeing smaller vehicles that are doing endpoint deliveries and doing more frequent trips to align with kind of same day delivery targets that Amazon and these other online retailers are trying to implement. But the typical status quo approach is either preparing a bylaw at the municipal level or creating load restrictions, depending on the time of the year. And it's mostly about kind of restricting where freight can go rather than being more conducive to where it can go. This presents an opportunity to be a little more proactive about it. So there's a bunch of tools that can be used here to address goods movement planning. But as I was mentioning before, we need to take a more holistic approach to this, because you can't just take a look at the freight network and say, okay, this is where the volume goes. We also need to take into account, as we do with the other modes of transportation, take into account where the land uses are, take into account what those ramifications would be for goods movement, how those may change over time in the future as a municipality or a state or a country grows. And now, I think previously I was working on developing a goods movement model for the province of Ontario, and had some collaboration with neighboring states in the US. And at that point, I think 10 years ago, we were limited in how we can collect goods movement data. It required me going out on the roadway and actually doing roadside surveys for truck drivers to get a sense on where they're going. But now we have a lot more tools at our disposal in terms of anonymized mobile app data. We have travel demand surveys and models and household surveys that can be used and tailored to give a better picture of freight movements without the associated or historical costs that typically were associated with that. And the value of this is, often when we do transportation master plans, we may address, goods movement tangentially, but these tools will equip, agencies to better identify, hey, yeah, we have a lot of freight movement going down these corridors, or a lot of freight movement going to these areas. So what can we do to enhance that and support that? Instead of going back and saying, okay, there's a lot of freight, we should probably restrict it so it doesn't affect this residential neighborhood. And what we're seeing is a lot of the principles we apply for the multimodal planning in terms of active transportation or automobile planning can be applied to the goods movement context as well. So we often do a gap analysis on where there's current active transportation links or roadway links. And I think that same analysis, identifying isolation factors with freight is a great opportunity to identify where on your network is there a risk to freight movement. So you may have a really important manufacturer or an industrial neighborhood that has limited access to it, that if there's one issue on that main road that accesses it, it could present a real risk to economic activity in the area. And in this example here, it's just an example of a cycling master plan we did where we identified, a critical link to cross this highway barrier. But, a similar type of analysis can be done for freight in identifying, where those goods movement areas are and whether they have adequate redundancies to support them from that aspect. We also have to be cognizant of, typically, I think historically at the site level, a lot of the way freight interacted with our land uses was kind of prescribed in zoning bylaws by applying loading or receiving docks at the endpoint. But, back to that earlier point about how online deliveries have increased, we're seeing a shift away from that to a certain degree, where we see a more demand for curb space rather than parcel deliveries looking to go to a loading bay. And that has real impacts for broader multimodal planning in terms of how does freight interact with our land uses, and how do we mitigate those conflicts between freight, pedestrians, cyclists, and all the other users on the roadway. And so if we look at, so here's an example. I was working on the Quayside Master Plan for Sidewalk Labs in Toronto, and we were working on some dynamic curves. And I think this is one of the important aspects, is if we embrace freight planning, there's opportunities to come up with some interesting solutions to what we're looking at. So, you know, the way our cities function over a day or over a week fluctuates, and it changes over time. And the reality is that our infrastructure, while it may be static, the way it's used isn't necessarily static throughout the day. So here's an example of how our anticipated demand of the curb would fluctuate throughout the day. And, you know, where demand doesn't meet the amount of space or supply, there's opportunities to shift that for other public realm initiatives, and maybe shift it for freight deliveries during a peak hour at 8 a.m. or something like that. Whereas, you know, the way that this is typically addressed through roadside restrictions or bylaws is, hey, we have a dedicated delivery zone here between this hour and that hour. But, you know, you may not have, you know, a static need for that delivery at that hour. It may not be conducive, you know, a bylaw that you created 5 years ago may not be conducive to the way that freight needs to be delivered today. So it's about monitoring and seeing opportunities on how you can accommodate freight, but also make it flexible so it can also be used for other modes as well. Another item that's coming into play is consolidation centers. So looking at how, you know, typically before there was larger freight vehicles that would do end deliveries between warehouses and, you know, a Walmart, for instance. But now, as we've seen online deliveries, we're seeing more trips, but with smaller vehicles. And so one way to combat that and reduce the amount of freight vehicles traveled is this new concept of consolidation centers, where you may have all your freight deliveries going to this one consolidation center in a neighborhood, and then you have a smaller number of vehicles that just deliver between the consolidation center and the end users. So there's a few different things that can be applied here in terms of making the freight network a little more nimbler. But at the end of the day, what we have to keep in mind is that, you know, whether it's planning for freight during COVID-19, during a pandemic, there's still opportunities to plan for it through our daily, you know, planning initiatives to justify, you know, doling out those dollars to support this infrastructure. And the benefit of that is so that you actually are proactive about planning the freight, so that you can create a more strategic network rather than dealing with it reactively after the fact. So in conclusion, you know, just like any other mobility system, freight changes with the changing economic environment. We're seeing that right now with COVID-19 and the changing delivery form factor from maybe brick and mortar stores to online retail. Regardless of whether it's COVID-19 or regular operations, small disruptions can lead to large impacts economically and on roadway operations. And it would behoove agencies to, you know, be proactive about planning for freight to mitigate these concerns. And on top of that, there's new tool sets that allow freight planning to be integrated into the broader multimodal planning effort, especially with new tools with anonymized mobile app data, better travel demand information within our regions. And then we can also apply a lot of the lessons we're applying concurrently with our other multimodal planning into the freight context. But we also have to be cognizant that it's not just about understanding how freight interacts on the links or in the in-between portions. We have to take a holistic view, just as we do with other modes of transportation, understanding how freight really interacts with our cities, you know, at the endpoints between where the road meets the sidewalk and all those points in between, because that's how we can create a freight network that, you know, both is conducive to complete streets, which is a lot of, you know, what a lot of agencies and municipalities are looking to achieve, but also we're also cognizant of the safety aspects and mitigating some of the historical issues that are associated with freight. So thank you, and just for everybody's knowledge, I'm based out of Toronto and I work for Tran-SET Consulting.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Brandon. That was excellent. We really appreciate it. Now I will introduce our last presenter, Herbie Masada. Herbie Masada is a Deputy Division Chief Principal Transportation Engineer in the California Department of Transportation and the chair of the NCHRP panelist of Catastrophic Transportation Emergency Management, a guide to emergency response planning at state transportation agencies and emergency management at state transportation agencies. He is also the president of Haiti Engineering, a nonprofit providing free engineering technical assistance to Haiti and other countries around the world, physical network vulnerability and resilience, capital, operational resource allocation, and multi-level, multi-criteria decision-making. Herbie, I will turn it over to you now.
Okay, thank you. Let me see here. Let me get my presentation up and going. Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Okay. Sorry. One more second.
Yeah, take your time.
Okay. How about now?
Yeah, now I can see it.
Okay. Okay. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Herbie Masada. I work for the California Department of Transportation. I was the emergency manager for Caltrans. We call it Caltrans out here for about 10 years. And since then, that office and many others I cover or responsible for. So let me start my presentation. To place California on the world stage, we have the 5th largest economy in the world with approximately 39.5 million people. Approximately 40% of all freight entering the United States passes through Southern California's Port of Long Beach and Port of Los Angeles to all points throughout our country, including Canada and Mexico. So with this presentation, it crosses over to the other DOTs as well. I was a member of AASHTO's SCOTSM Special Committee on Transportation Security Emergency Management, the chair for disaster management, emergency management for them. So I got a varied background when it comes to emergency management. Caltrans in California, we have 12 district offices as well as headquarters office in Sacramento and hundreds of buildings in addition to the roads that we maintain and operate. The state DOTs have a lot of responsibilities, not just the state highway system. A lot of us manage freight and passenger rail, ports and ferries, general and commercial aviation facilities, bike and pedestrian paths, all that you see on the screen, and some even have a Department of Motor Vehicles, I guess, depending on the state that you're in. The state DOTs are the owner-operators of the system that they service and maintain. It's a pretty huge responsibility, you know. It's a lot of real estate out there that we operate and maintain. Most disasters impact and cause physical damage to people and structures. Pandemics impact human resources and society. So we are either responsible for or help support the State Emergency Support Function 1, which is transportation at the state government level. We coordinate with the federal ESF, with the United States Department of Transportation. In regard to National Response Framework, we support all of the other ESFs because of all the dependencies and interdependencies to the transportation network. While this may be an ESF 8, which is a medically focused event, we are in support of ESF 8 because of the dependency of the transportation network in helping to execute the deliverables of ESF 8 and the other ESFs. California is host to all these types of disasters that you see on the screen. Because of this, we are known by many as the Disneyland of disasters. Now we're entering fire season, but unlike Disneyland, we've got to keep the roads open for business at all times. The traditional approach. Pandemics are just one of the many calamities with which humans may be confronted. Unlike hurricanes, earthquakes, industrial accidents, which are localized and damage infrastructure, pandemics are global and do not cause physical damage to the infrastructure. Rather than one geographical area responding and others in other areas lending aid, many communities will have to respond to a pandemic at the same time, so resources may not be able to be shifted. Widespread absenteeism and challenges in containing the disease will disrupt how communities work, socialize, and travel. In the state of California, we've been real lucky not to be hit as hard as, let's say, New York. Basic emergency management infrastructure and an all hazards preparedness approach are essential for organizations to be able to manage a pandemic. However, additional hazard-specific activities are also required to ensure both continuity of operations and safety of staff and the traveling public. Transportation agencies that lack an understanding of pandemics and do not take specific preparedness actions will likely struggle to respond safely and effectively. Pre-planning preparedness. The transportation agencies prepare for a pandemic by understanding the threat of a pandemic, what constitutes a pandemic, how it will likely impact the organization, and who has a role in responding to it. It is critical to know what can be done to mitigate the impact, what decisions about service will have to be made, and what tools and resources are available to help. Some of the planning tools that we use in the state of California, Department of Caltrans, pandemic plans, continuity of operation, continuity of government planning, emergency operations plans at district and headquarter levels. We have a winter operations plan. We're just now leaving winter, so we're entering the fire season. So IT recovery plans, strike plans, checklists for field operations, exercises, Department Operations Centers, Emergency Operations Centers. We do a lot of research and a lot of training of staff. So we base actions and plans on research of what people will actually do during an emergency or disaster. Design systems and plans to support and address those actions. People will probably act in what they believe is in their best interests. Like you see people hoarding toilet paper, for example, or whatever those necessities are. So we always engage law enforcement in California in our plans, whether it's construction, maintenance, or whatever. The California Highway Patrol is always there with us. In response, our response continues to be the same, but our maintenance activities have changed. Because of the season, we're now entering the fire season. We're mowing. We're just now leaving the winter season. Believe it or not, it snowed just a few weeks ago in the mountains here again, and we're prepping again for the fire season, mowing and doing things like that. So for our response, our DOCs and EOCs, DOCs and EOCs have been activated. We're coordinated with the California Office of Emergency Services, Federal Highways, FEMA, the Transportation Research Board, AASHTO, USDOT. We've conducted neighboring Department of Transportation meetings, the coordination meetings, to see how the other DOTs adjacent to us are doing and what we can, or how we can help each other. Mission tasking is a way of the governor tasking Caltrans to assist off the state highway system to local government and others that may need help. Is capabilities based. Even though we're Department of Transportation, we can go and build buildings or whatever that he may need to help throughout this pandemic or emergency. So we've been getting mission tasked a lot for things not really related to the transportation system, because we have, again, surveyors, engineers, just a host of people, right-of-way agents. Social distancing is being exercised here at Caltrans as in other DOTs around the state, certainly around the country. Our changeable message signs have been activated with signage telling people what they should be doing during this event. And with sheltering in place for the most part, a lot of employees are working from home, teleworking, and purchasing laptops for these folks. And we're eliminating in-person meetings as best we can. So we're implementing teleconferencing for internal and external customers. We're doing our best in distributing PPEs, personal protective equipment in the field and offices. And again, everybody is trying to find these things. We're using posters wherever we can, letting people know how to best manage COVID, whether it's washing their hands or social distancing, whatever. These are in all our facilities, rest areas, just wherever. We've been developing emergency supply chain mapping to identify and support of critical supply chain corridors, the redirection of prioritization of critical staff to maintain and support these routes and corridors. I recently checked with some of our regions around the state to see what the absenteeism is. It's relatively the same as if any other season. Again, we've been real lucky to not have COVID impact us so badly with our maintenance field forces. And we identified essential and non-essential employees. We're doing our best to follow best management practices set by the Center for Disease Control and local health departments. And for example, this fuel management is something else that we're using commercial fuel as much as possible, keeping bulk fuel stations. Some of our maintenance facilities have bulk fuel stations. We're keeping them topped off as best as possible in case of fuel disruption, but so far this has not been an issue. We're testing all emergency operations centers. We're having workers use individual vehicles as best we can and splitting work shifts. So specific to office personnel, again, with the following BMPs, best management practices set by the CDC, Center for Disease Control, and local health officials. The teleworking options, we've canceled large meetings and training, and we've identified essential staff that should be working or hopefully working in our big offices. For the traveling public, for the most part, we were maintaining the infrastructure and highway system to continue mobility throughout the state. We've again activated Department Operations Centers and the local emergency operations centers to support information to the public through our public information office. And we're maintaining rest areas, and hopefully they're open and adequately maintained, although we're experiencing some thefts in some areas of toilet tissues and things like that at these rest areas. And we've suspended all cash toll collection in the Bay Area. Everything now in the state of California when it comes to toll collection for the state highway system is all electronic. That was as of, I believe, sometime in March 20th. So the license plate readers, and you'll get a bill in the mail. As for recovery, it's hopefully it's outlined in your plan, such as returning to work, assessing impacts to staff and infrastructure, cost recovery, and how will we operate moving forward. This is all new to us, at least when it comes to COVID, and this is the first real pandemic that we've had in my lifetime. So again, this is all new to us, but the overarching, I guess, recovery is very similar, I think, to any of the other type of disasters. We're going to have to assess infrastructure and do things like that. But again, we're still we're doing hot washes and trying to figure out how we're going to move forward. For mitigation, hopefully we're looking forward and past this and planning for future similar events and all hazards approach. We're an all hazard state. It could be snowing right now. It could be raining somewhere. It could be, it's fire season. So we've had all these compound events happen in the past, and flash floods, it could, along with this COVID. So we're expecting this to be a really tough season for us. So again, like laptops instead of desktops throughout the organization where applicable, so people can take their laptops home and not have to worry about taking these big bulky computers that really we don't really need, I think, moving forward. Switch over to cell phones and drop the desk phones, save some costs there, and people can operate more remotely. Look at supply chain issues. We must review this event and develop mitigation strategies. Some of the mitigation strategies will come from the Center for Disease Control and other health organizations. And we must enhance our approach to similar types of events in the future, lean forward, which our state has, state of California. That's pretty much it for me. I just want to conclude, this is a point in time, and hopefully in no way, shape, or form, this becomes a new norm. And, using the words new norm or new normal is a defeatist, at least to me it is. And we will get beyond this point in time, hopefully stronger than ever. So thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Herbie. We certainly appreciate that. So this concludes the presentation portion of the webinar. So I can see some questions in the QA box, so I will read them lively. So the first question is to Laura. Where is all this relief money coming from?
Well, that's a great question. And a very, very interesting one. So, working in Congress, for Congress, lobbying Congress for many years, it's really interesting the phases of whether things have to be paid for or not. There were so many years of pay-go rules where you absolutely couldn't pass any piece of legislation unless there was an offset, or money was, basically repealed or rescinded somewhere else. Those days are absolutely outside of the realm of reality in the world of COVID-19. So what Congress is doing is basically just adding to the national debt and the federal deficit. So projections prior to COVID-19 were that our debt was going to be like $1 trillion for 2020. Now, with all the COVID relief efforts, we're looking at $3.7 trillion in debt for 2020. So we're seeing a massive increase with no end in sight. But I will say that the Republicans all of a sudden have started freaking out about the spending. Not everyone, but many of them. And so Majority Leader McConnell has said we need to pump the brakes and see how the spending starts to help folks before we continue to spend willy-nilly. So there's going to be a big tug of war now, very political in election year between the Democrats and the Republicans on whether you spend now and ask questions later, or whether there's a halt. But ultimately everything has to get signed by the president. So it's going to be a very interesting process going forward on this phase 4 package and trying to get it passed. Having a massive bill, I think it's a $3 trillion bill off of my memory that Speaker Pelosi is trying to pass this Friday. That is going to just add to our situation with the financial concerns. So I know it's a terrible tightrope with the situation that Americans are in today, but also realizing like, where are we borrowing this money from? So it's an interesting situation.
Okay, thank you very much, Laura. So the second question is also for you. I read the question. Thanks for the interesting presentation. You mentioned rural roads. Do you think there will be money left for repairing unsafe rural roads, and why there should be funding for this purpose?
Another great question. So I'll stress that this $15 billion in relief that the House Democrats are proposing that hasn't been signed into law yet for the DOTs is very fluid, obviously, because it's not been signed into law and we don't know when that will happen. But I will also stress that how it was structured, I believe, in the Democratic proposal is that it would be for, there would be a lot of flexibility. That was the intention, whether, the DOTs have to use it to keep the lights on, or whether it's to continue projects that they have scheduled for this summer, or, really, they tried to give the DOTs as much flexibility as possible. So I'd imagine some of it would get down to rural roads, but all this discretion is going to be under the DOTs if it gets signed into law. But as far as the needs go, I mean, I would say there are massive needs on our rural roads. And I don't know whether you're aware, but there's an organization called TRIP. It's tripnet.org. They just issued a new rural roads infrastructure needs report this very week. If you haven't checked it out, it's a great resource for you. TRIP does some very thoughtful research. And what they found in their study released this week was that rural roads have a $211 billion backlog in funding needs for repair and improvements on our rural transportation system. They found 13% of our rural roads are in poor condition, and 21% are in mediocre condition, and 16% are in fair condition. So they just have some really good analysis down to individual states, like basically ranking the states with the biggest rural road infrastructure problems and safety problems. So if you haven't checked it out, I would highly encourage it. Again, tripnet.org is where you can find it.
All right, thank you very much, Laura. So the third question, I believe it's to Herbie. It's what does ESF mean, please?
Okay, ESF means Emergency Support Function, and what it is ESF1 is transportation. I believe there's communications is an ESF, health is a ESF, like ESF8, and they group these organizations like with certain capabilities. Like there's the state ESF and a federal ESF. So for transportation, ESF1 is led by United States Department of Transportation. So it's like let's say the state of California, we group ESF1. There's maritime. There's I'm not sure if the pipelines, but the feds have pipelines as a mode of transportation. It's a grouping of people, organizations that can respond to an emergency. So if you're a transportation agency or just whatever in transportation, you're in ESF1. Caltrans is the state of California. Caltrans is ESF1, and we respond as ESF1 during the emergencies.
All right, thank you very much, Herbie. So our final question is asking about the slides. So yeah, we will post the slides and the webinar on our website, and the link for the website is in the chat box. Also, I got a final question. It's to all the panelists, I think. I read the question. Are there any specific funding or program initiatives related to using drones for freight delivery or delivery of medical tests and supplies? So this is to all the speakers, this question.
I can give a bit of not in terms of funding, just in terms of kind of maybe my experience with drone. We have evaluated drone deliveries in certain areas. I think some of the sticking points there is it's still kind of a nascent technology for freight deliveries, and I think there's a lot of concerns about, you know, where that's applicable, particularly, you know, especially if we're looking at areas where there's high volumes of commercial airline activity. I think there's a lot of concern about how it's going to integrate with that, at least from the planning perspective. In terms of funding, I'm not aware, but at least from the planning perspective, I know there's a number of issues like that are being navigated and still being figured out.
Yeah, this is Laura, and I don't know of any specific funding programs, although I do feel like I saw a blurb or an article on this very topic a little while ago. I just don't remember the details. I apologize. I think at least it's being debated and discussed, I would argue, in Congress. But I do think, you know, with drones and security, a lot of it, I'm sure, has to do with, you know, restrictions, whether they're state restrictions, federal restrictions. I know drones are just, you know, being regulated or trying to be regulated. So I think there are a lot of pieces to that puzzle.
And this is Herbie. I know Caltrans, we have a division of aeronautics, and we license all the general aviation, like LAX and SFO. And so what I'm trying to say is that I'm not sure, but I'm going to go ahead and ask my division of aeronautics. It's not a topic that's come up in the past, at least with me. And I know I was on their drone committee a few years ago, so I'm going to try to get an update. Good question.
All right, so I think this summarizes our question session. So I do want to thank again all the three presenters. I think this really turned out to be a very well technical program and presentation. Again, I want to thank the attendees, and please let me know if you have any questions about the webinar series or about the Tran-SET in general. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.